In this section of notes, we're going to look at something called mosaic plots. Mosaic plots are another way to analyze categorical data, but we like to look at these when the populations from the different subgroups are very different. So maybe like if you wanted to compare the students at our school versus the teachers. There's a lot more students than there are teachers, and you might want to take that into account. So here, you might notice in this mosaic plot, it looks an awful lot like a stacked bar graph, but then the bars are pushed together. And then you also might notice that the width of the bars for morning, afternoon, and evening, they're different widths. So all of that means something. So again, this mosaic plot is another way to look at categorical data. It's kind of like a pie chart, but remember, a pie chart is only for one population, whereas the mosaic plot here, we're able to see three populations. So we're looking at the population for the period of the day that the dolphins are active. Just like the pie chart has pieces split into like the little slivers of the pie, the mosaic plot shows the pieces or the categories as the smaller rectangles. If you want to look at just one group and what proportion of each group has each type of travel, I guess, in this one here. So like if you looked at just your morning group, you can see that it's just under 10% have the travel activity, whereas starting at about 10% and going to 60%, so that'd be close to 50%, would have that social activity. That you're looking at just the vertical piece. But if you want to compare the size of the subgroups, so compare the amount of activity happening in the morning, the afternoon, and the evening, then you're looking at the width. So you can see there's less activity in the afternoon, and that's noted by how the afternoon bar is more narrow than the morning or the evening bars. So if we want to make a mosaic plot, first we look at our table of values that shows all of the different categories of our variables. And then we want to split up our, in this case, the periods, morning, afternoon, evening. We want to take those subtotals and we want to turn those into percentages. That's going to show us how wide to make each of the bars. So the morning activity accounts for 38% of all the activity, and the evening activity accounts for about 42% of all the activity. So those two numbers are pretty close. So the bar for morning and evening should be close to the same width, with evening being just a little bit thicker. But afternoon activity is about 20%. That's almost half as wide as either morning or evening. So when we go to make our bars, we should show that appropriately. So we see evening and morning are almost the same size, with evening being a little bit wider and afternoons close to about half of that size. Next, then we look at the different types of activities to figure out how high to make essentially like each of the pieces in the stacked bar graphs. So we find these subtotals. So for morning, we've got 6 out of 72 of the activities recorded were travel, 38 out of 72 were social, 28 out of 72 were feeding. So we find those like subtotals and then turn those into percentages. And that tells us how high to make each of the stacked little rectangles in that bar. And then you basically just repeat that whole thing for each of the other bars. So the afternoon bar and the evening bar. And that is it. That is essentially how we end up making our mosaic plot. Now, when we talked about the segmented bar graphs or the stacked bar graphs, we talked about how we could see whether or not there was an association between two variables. And we can do that here too. So basically, if you want to know if there's an association, you kind of ignore the width of the bars. So we don't really care here that morning is wider than afternoon. But what we look at instead is the height of the different colors. So we're looking at the height of the dark blue bars. The fact that the dark blue bars are very different, so the afternoon dark blue bar is much higher than the morning or evening, that would be evidence to suggest that there is an association between the time of day and the type of activity that the dolphins are engaging in. However, If instead our graphs looked like this, so all the dark blue is the same height, all the light blue is the same height, all of the orange is the same height, that would be evidence to suggest that there's not an association between the time of day and the type of activity.